Hello, Booktube, Part 2 to The Light Blue Stocking, Chapter 7. Not many Sundays after Mrs. Thrall's Thanksgiving, she had a visitor at Streatham. A visitor who, when he left, carried with him, as a token of her regard, two little calf-bound volumes, in one of which was the inscriptions. This book, written by Dr. Samuel Johnson, was presented to Mrs. Gabrielle Pelosi by Hester Litch Thrall, Streatham, Sunday, 10th June, 1781, with a further note in an equally clear and flowing hand, and 28 years after that time presented again to his nephew, John Poesy, Salisbury, by Hester Litch Poesy, uh, Burnpal, 1st August, 1809. I am able to be exact in this small matter, for the volumes in question are given me not long ago by a friend who understands my passion for such things. The book was the first edition of the Prince of Abyssinia. It was not known as Rasselas until after Johnson's death, and Mrs. Thrall at the time did not know Poesy sufficiently well to spell his name correctly, but she was soon to learn, and to learn too, that she was in love with him and he with her. She had first met Poesy about a year before in a minuscule in a music hall in the house of Dr. Burney, Fanny's father. On the occasion, she had taken advantage of his back being turned to mimic him as he sat at the piano. For this, she was reprimanded by Dr. Burney, and she must have felt that she deserved the correction, for she took it in good part and behaved with great decorum during the rest of the evening. After a year in her widow's weeds, which must have tormented Johnson, for he hated the thought of death and liked to see ladies dressed in gay colors, she laid aside her severe black and began to resume her place in society. The newspapers remarked the change, and every man who entered her house was referred to as a possible husband for the rich and attractive widow. Finally, she was obliged to write to the papers and ask them they would let the subject alone. But it soon became evident to Johnson and to the rest of the world that Poesy was successfully laying siege to the lady, as why should he not? The fact that he was a Catholic, an Italian, and a musician could hardly have appeared to him as reasons why he should not court a woman of rare charm and distinction, with whom he had been on terms of friendship for several years. A woman who was of suitable age and the mistress of a fine estate and £3,000 a year, and whose children were no longer children but young ladies of independent fortune. That she should marry some one seemed certain. Why not Poesy? Her daughters protested, and their mother was disgracing herself with them, and the world held up its hands in horror at the thought. The co-executors of the estate became actually insulting, and Fanny Burney was so shocked at the idea that she finally gave up visiting Streatham altogether. Society ranged itself for and against the lady, few for, many against. There were other troubles too. A lawsuit involving a large sum was decided against her, and Johnson, ill, querulous, and exacting, behaved as an irritable old man would who felt his influence in the family waning. I am a Johnsonian. Tinker has called me so, and Tinker may be depended upon to know a Johnsonian when he sees one. But I am bound to admit that Johnson had behaved badly and was to behave worse. Johnson was very human, and the lady was very human too. They had come to a parting of the ways. It was inevitable that the life at Streatham must be terminated. Its glory had departed, and the expense of its upkeep was too great for the lady. So a tenant was secured, and Mrs. Thrall and Dr. Johnson prepared to leave the house in which so many happy years had been spent. Dr. Johnson was once more to make his lodgings in Bolt Court, and Mrs. Thrall, after a visit to Brighton, was to go to Bath to repose her purse. The engagement or understanding, or whatever it was, with Poesy was broken off, and Italy was proposed as a place of residence for him. broken hearts there were in plenty. Life for Mrs. Thrall and at Bath proved to be impossible. If concealment did not feed on the damask of her cheek, love did, and at last it became evident, even to the young ladies, that their mother was pining away for Piozzi, and they gave their consent with that he be recalled. He came at once. Mrs. Thrall, on his departure, had sent him a poem which reached him at Dover. She now sent him another which was designed to reach him on his return at Calais. Over mountains, rivers, valleys, see my love returns to Calais. After all their taunts and malice, entreating safe the gates of Calais, while delayed by winds he dallies, fretting to be kept at Calais. Muse prepare some sprightly sallies to divert my dear at Calais. Say how early rogue who rallies envies him who waits at Calais for her that would disdain a palace compared to poesy, love, and Calais. Pretty poor poetry, those who know tell me, but if poesy liked it, it served its purpose. And now Mrs. Thrall announced her engagement in a circular letter to her co-executors under the Thrall will, sending in addition to Johnson a letter in which she says, the dread of your disappropriation has given me some anxious moments, and I feel as if acting without a parent's consent till you write kindly to me. Johnson's reply is historic. Madam, if I interpret your letter right, you are ignominiously married. If it is yet undone, let us once more talk together. If you have abandoned your children and your religion, God forgive your wickedness. If you have forfeited your fame and your country, may your folly to no further mischief. If the last act is yet to do, I who have loved you, esteemed you, reverenced you, and served you, I who long taught you you the first of womankind, entreat that before your fate is irrevocable, I may once more see you. I once was, madam, your most truly yours, Sam Johnson, July 2nd, 1784. It was a smashing letter and showed that the mind which had composed the famous letter to Chesterfield and another equally forceful to Macpherson had not lost its vigor. But those letters had brought no reply. His letter to Mrs. Thrall did, and one at once dignified and respectable. The little lady was no novice in letter writing, and I can imagine that upon the arrival of her letter, the weary, heartsick, and old man wept. Remember that his emotions were seldom completely under his control, and that he had nothing of the bear about him but his skin. Sir, she wrote, I have this morning received from you so rough a letter in reply to one which was both tenderly and respectfully written, that I am forced to desire the conclusion of a correspondence which I can bear to continue no longer. The birth of my second husband is not meaner than that of my first. His sentiments are not meaner. His profession is not meaner, and his superiority is what to be. And his superiority is what he professes, acknowledged by all mankind. Is it want of fortune? Then that is ignominious. That character of the man I have chosen has no other claim to such an epithet. The religion to which he has been always a zealous adherent will, I hope, teach him to forgive insults as he has not deserved. Mine will, I hope, enable me to bear them at once with dignity and patience. To hear that I have forfeited my fame is indeed the greatest insult I have yet received. My fame is an unsullied as snow, so I should think it unworthy of him who must henceforth protect it. Johnson, she says, wrote once more, but the letter has never come to light. The correspondence, which had continued over a period of 20 years, was at an end. An interesting letter of Thomas Hardy on the subject came into my possession recently. In it, he says, I am in full sympathy with Mrs. Thrall under the painful opposition to her marriage with Piozzi. The single excuse for Johnson's letter to her on that occasion would be that he was her lover himself and hoped to win her. Otherwise, it was simply brutal. I do not think that Johnson was her lover, and I am afraid I must agree that Johnson was brutal. In extenuation, I urged that he was a very, very sick old man. At the time, Mrs. Thrall's characters were many and her defenders few. 2 dates were given as a time of her marriage, which started some wandering lies, much to her disadvantage. The fact is that both dates were correct, for she was married to Piozzi once by a Catholic and several weeks later by a Church of England ceremony. In her journals, she writes under date of July 25th, 1784, I am now the wife of my faithful Piozzi. He loves me and will be mine forever. The whole Christian Church, Catholic and Protestant, are all witnesses. For 2 years they traveled the continent. No marriage could have been happier. Piozzi, by comparison with his wife, is a rather shadowy person. He is described as being a handsome man, a few months older than she, with gentle, pleasant, unaffected manners, very eminent in his profession, nor was he, as was frequently stated, a man without a fortune. The difference in their religious views was the cause of no difficulty. Each respected the religion of the other and kept his or her own. I would preserve my religious opinions inviolate at Milan, as my husband did his in London, in an entry to her journal. She was staying at Milan when tidings of Johnson's death reached her. All of her correspondents hastened to apprise her of the news. I have a long letter of her from one Henry Johnson, who I am unable to determine, written one day after the funeral, describing the procession forming at Bolt Court, the taking of mourning couches in Fleet Street, and the proceeding to Westminster Abbey, where the corpse was laid close to the remains of David Garrick, Esquire. That Madame Piozzi, we must now call her, was deeply affected. We cannot doubt, only a few days before the news of his death reached her, we find her writing to a friend, urging him not to neglect Dr. Johnson, saying, "You will never see any other mortal so wise or so good. I keep his picture constantly beside me." Before long, she heard, too, that several of her old friends had engaged to write his life, and Piozzi urged her to do one of the number. The result was the anecdotes of the late Samuel Johnson during the last 20 years of his life. It is not a great work, but considering the circumstances under which it was written, her journals being locked up in England while she was writing at Florence, greater faults than were found in it could have been overlooked. It provided Boswell with some good anecdotes for his great work, and it attended Hawkins' Life of Johnson by about a year. Antedated Hawkins' Life of Johnson by about a year. The public appetite was whetted by the early publication of Boswell's Journal of the Tour of Hebrides, in which he had given a taste of the quality, and the anecdotes appeared at the time when everything which related to Johnson had a great vogue. The book was published by Cadell, and so great was the demand that the first edition was exhausted on the day of publication, so that when the king sent for a copy in the evening on the day of its publication, the publisher had to beg for one from a friend. Bozzey and Pozzoe thus became rival biographers in the opinion of the public, and the public got what pleasure it could out of numerous caricatures and satires with which the bookshops abound, many of these being amusing and some simply scurrilous, after the fashion of the time. Meanwhile, the Poeses had become tired of travel and wished again to enjoy the luxury of a home. Prevail on Mr. Poesy to settle in England had been Dr. Johnson's parting advice. It was not difficult to do so, and on their return after a short stay in London, they took up residence in Bath. Here Madame Poesy, encouraged by the success of the Anecdotes, devoted herself to the publication of 2 volumes of letters to and from the late Samuel Johnson. Their preparation for the press was somewhat crude. It consisted largely in making omissions here and there and substituting asterisks for proper names, but the copyright was sold and £500 for £500, and the letters showed, if indeed it was necessary to show, how intimate had been the relationship between the doctor and herself. And as time went on, there awakened in Madame Poesy a longing for the larger life at Streatham, and her husband, always anxious to accomplish her wishes, decided that she would return to the scene of her former triumphs. But Dr. Johnson, the keystone of the social arch, was gone, and there was no one to take his place. Her husband was a cultured gentleman, but he was not in the English manner he was not to the English manner born. The attempt was made, however, and on the 7th anniversary of their wedding day at Streatham The attempt was made, however, and on the 7th anniversary of their wedding day, Streatham was thrown open. 70 people sat down to dinner, and house and grounds were illuminated, and the villagers were made welcome. 1,000 people thronged through the estate. One might have supposed that a young lord had come into his own. It was a brave effort, but it was soon seen to be unavailing. A man's fame may be like a shuttlecock, having constantly to be struck and to preventing its falling, but not a woman's. She had lost caste by her marriage. It was not forgotten that her husband was a foreigner, and he had been a fiddler, and his wife had been the object of too much ridicule, the subject of too many lampoons. But the lady had resources within herself. She was an inveterate reader, and she had tasted the joys of authorship. She now published a volume of travels and busied herself with several other books, the varying names of which are forgotten except by the curious in such matters. While she was thus engaged, a bitter and scandalous attack was made upon her and Baretti. Now, Baretti was a liar, and in proof of her good sense and favoring disposition, I offer in evidence the entry that she made in her journal when she heard of his death. Baretti is dead. Poor Baretti. He died as he lived, less like a Christian than a philosopher, leaving no debts but those of gratitude, undischarged and unexpressing neither regret for the past nor for fear of the future. A wit rather than a scholar, strong in his prejudices, haughty in spirit, cruel in anger. He is dead. So is my enmity. On another occasion, she contrived to quiet a hostile critic. With who had ridiculed her in verse. Much damage may be done by a couplet, as she well knew, and the lines, "See thrall's grey widow with a satchel roam, and bring a pomp's laborious nothings home," were not nice. However true they might be, Madame Poesy determined to take him in hand. She contrived at the house of a friend to get herself placed opposite to him at a supper table, and after observing his perplexity with amusement for a time, she raised the wine glass to him and prepared a toast, "Good fellowship for the future." The critic was glad to avail himself of the dainty means of escape from an awkward situation. However, it was evident that life at Streatham could not be continued on the old scale. Funds were not as plentiful as in the days of the great brewmaster, so after a few years, when her husband suggested their retiring to their native Wales, she was glad to fall in with the idea. A charming site was selected in a villa built in the Italian style after her husband's design. It was called Brindbella, meaning beautiful brow, half Welsh and half Italian, like its owners. I fancy their lives were happier there than they had been elsewhere, for they built upon their own foundation. Piozzi had his piano and his violin, and the lady busied herself with her books, while the monotony of existence was pleasantly broken by occasional visits to Bath, there where they had many friends. And during these years, letters and notes, uh, comment and criticism dropped from her pen like leaves from a tree in autumn. She lived over again in memory her life in London, reading reading industriously and busy in the present and largely profitless way, which tends to make days pass into months and months into years and leave no trace of their passing. She must always have had a pen in her hand. It goes without saying that she had kept a diary. In those days, everyone did, and most had less than she to record. It was Dr. Johnson who suggested that she get a little book and write in it all the anecdotes she might hear, observations she might make, or verse and might otherwise be lost. These instructions were followed literally, but no little book sufficed. She filled many large quarto volumes, 6 of which, entitled Thrallania, passed through the London auction rooms in 1908, bringing £2,050. One volume which perhaps does not belong to the series, but which in every way accords with Dr. Johnson's suggestion, formed part of the late A.M. Bodley's collection until, at his death, it passed with several other items into that of the writer. Mr. Bodley took an ardent interest in everything that related to Mrs. Thrall, and published a few years ago her Journal of the Welsh tour undertaken in the summer of 1774. Dr. Johnson also kept a diary on this journey, but his is bad and fragmentary, while that of the lady is intimate and consecutive narrative. The original manuscript volume, in this original dark limp leather binding, is before me. It comprises 97 pages in Mrs. Thrall's beautiful hand, beginning on Tuesday, 5th of July, 1774. I began my journey through Wales. We set out from Streatham on our coach and 4 past post horses, accompanied by Dr. Johnson and our eldest daughter. Baretti went with us as far as London, where we left him, and hiring fresh horses, they carried us to the meter at Barnet, and so on throughout the whole tour until she made this her final entry. September 30th. When I rose, Mr. Thrall informed me that the Parliament was suddenly dissolved and that all the world was bustle, and we were to go up to Suffolk, not to Streatham, and canvass away. I heard the first part of this report with pleasure, the latter with pain. Nothing but a real misfortune could, I think, affect me so much as to the thoughts of going to town, thus to settle for the winter, before I have had any enjoyment of Streatham at all. And so, my hopes and pleasure blowing away, I thought to have lived in Streatham in quiet and comfort, have kissed my children and cuffed them by turns, and had a place always for them to play in, and here I must be shut up in that odious dungeon, where nobody will come near me. The children are to be sick of want of air, and I am never to see the face but Mr. Johnson's. Oh, what a life that is, and how truly do I abhor it. At noon, however, I saw my girls, and thought Susan vastly improved. At evening I saw my boys, and them very well, too. How much is there always to thank God for, but I dare not enjoy poor Streatham, lest I should be forced to quit it. I value this little volume highly, as who interested in the lady would not. It is an unaffected record of a journey, of interesting people who met interesting people, whoever they might be, and its publication by Bodley was a pious act, but that the Bodley volume published a few years ago gets its chief value from the sympathetic introduction by Thomas Seacombe must, I think, be admitted. It is no longer the fashion to be blush as well as weep for Mrs. Thrall. This silly phrase is Macaulay's, rather, as Sir Walter Raleigh remarked to me in going over some of her papers in my library. What a dear, delightful person she was. I have always wanted to meet her. In the future, what may be written of Mrs. Thrall will be written in better taste. At these times of day, why should she be attacked upon because she married a man who did not speak English as his mother tongue, and who was a musician rather than a brewer? One may be an enthusiastic admirer of Dr. Johnson. I confess I am, and yet keep a warm place in one's heart for the kindly and charming little woman. Admit that she was not the scholar she thought she was, and she was inaccurate in narration. What matters it? She was a woman of character, too. She was not overpowered by Dr. Johnson, as was Fanny Burney, to such a degree that it was she that at last she came to write like him, only more so. Mrs. Thrall, by her own crisp, vigorous English, influenced the doctor finally to write as he talked, naturally, without that undue elaboration which was characteristic of his earlier style. If Johnson mellowed under the benign influence of the lady, she was the gainer in knowledge, especially in such knowledge as comes from books. It was Mrs. Thrall rather than her husband who formed the Streatham Library. Her taste was robust. She balked at no foreign language, but she sat down to study it. I have never seen a book from her library, and I have seen many, which was not filled with notes written in her clear and beautiful hand. These volumes, like the books which Lamb lent Coleridge, and which he returned with annotations tripling their value, are occasionally offered for sale in those old bookshops where our resolution not to be tempted to writ in so much water, or they turn up at auction sales and astonish the uninitiated by the prices they bring. Several of these volumes are in the collection of the writer. Her dictionary, the gift of Dr. Johnson, for instance, and the life of Salmanazar, another gift from the same source. But the book which, above all others, every Johnsonian would wish to own is the property of Mrs. Amy Lowell of Boston, a poet of rare distinction, a critic, and America's most distinguished woman collector. Who does not envy her the possession of the first edition of Boswell's Life of Johnson, filled with the marginalia of the one person in the world whose knowledge of the old man rivaled that of the great biographer himself? And to hear Mrs. Lowell quote these notes in a manner suggestive of the charming of Madame Poesie herself is a delight never to be forgotten. About the time of the Poesie's removal to Wales, they decided to adopt a nephew, the son of Poesie's brother, who had met with financial reverses in Italy. The boy has been christened John Salisbury in honor of Mrs. Poesie, and she becomes greatly attached to the lad and decided to leave him her entire fortune. He was brought up as an English boy, and his education was a matter which gave her serious concern. Meanwhile, the years that had touched the lady so lightly had left their impress upon her husband, who does not seem to have been strong. He was a great sufferer from gout, and finally died and was buried in the parish church of Tremarchon, which years before he had caused to be repaired, and had built there a burial vault in which his remains were placed. They have lived in perfect harmony for 25 years, thus affectionately overturning the prophecies of their friends. She continued to reside at Brynbella until the marriage of her adopted son, when she generously gave them the estate and removed to Bath, that lovely little city where so many celebrities have gone to pass the closing years of eventful lives. At a Bath cat, as a Bath cat, she continued her interest in men, women, and books until the end. Having outlived all her friends, she proceeded to make new, and when nearly 80, astonished everyone by showing great partiality for a young and handsome actor, and, if reports are true, a very bad actor, named Conway. There was much smoke and doubtless some fire in the affair. Letters purported to be hers to him were published after her death. They may not be genuine, and if they are, they show simply, as Leslie Stevens had said, that at a very advanced age she became silly. And on her 80th birthday, she gave a ball to 600 or 700 people in the assembly rooms at Bath, and led the dancing herself with her adopted son, who was by this time Sir John Salisbury Piozzi, very much to her satisfaction. A year later, she met with an accident, from the effects of which she died. She was buried in Tremalkin Church beside her husband. A few years ago, on the 200th anniversary of the birth of Johnson, a memorial tablet was erected in the quaint old church reading, "Near this place are interred the remains of Hester Lynch Piozzi, Dr. Johnson's Mrs. Thrall, born 1741, died 1821. Mrs. Piozzi's life is her most enduring work. Trifles were her serious business, and she was never idle. Always a great letter writer, she set in motion a correspondence which would have taxed a capacity of a secretary with a typewriter. To the last, she was a great reader, and observing a remark in Boswell on the irksomeness of books to people of advanced age, she wrote in the margin, "Not to me at 80." Her wonderful memory remained unimpaired until the last. She knew English literature well. She spoke French and Italian fluently. Latin was transcribed with ease and grace. Of Greek she had a smattering, and, as she said, to have had a working knowledge of Hebrew, but I expect that her Hebrew would have set a scholar's hair on end. With all these accomplishments, she was not a pedant, or properly speaking, a blue stocking, or if she was, it was of a very light shade of blue. She told a capital story, omitted everything irrelevant, and came to the point at once. In brief, she was a man's woman. And to end the argument where it began, for arguments always end where they begin. I came across a remark the other day which sums up my contention. It was to the effect that in whatever company Mrs. Piozzi found herself, others found her the most charming person in the room. And there ends Chapter 7, Light Blue Stocking. Next time is Volume 8, A Ridiculous Philosopher. Now, do check out Amy's channel, from the Dusty Bookshelf, where she reads a Edward Newton book, this book-selling game, and she's reading chapters on the alternate days that I am. So I'll be back next time with Chapter 8. Thank you, BookTube.